The photograph lay in the middle of the table beneath the strip light. I had seen that face hundreds of times. Silver blonde hair, pale blue eyes, a calm smile that never looked forced. It was the face beside my breakfast each morning and on my phone before I slept. The face I had imagined across from me at a small table near the coast. Detective Constable Aisha Rahman sat opposite me in a private interview room at York Police Station. Before her lay WhatsApp messages, bank transfers, and a list of dates. Near my elbow sat a small jewelry box. Inside was the engagement ring I had never given Elaine. Aisha turned the photograph towards me. "Mr. Langford, are you certain this is the woman you believed you were speaking to?" I looked at it for several seconds. "That was her face," I said, "but I now know it was never her life." 6 weeks earlier, I had been preparing to leave England with her. I had packed Margaret's clothes into cardboard boxes after keeping them untouched for nearly 4 years. Her winter coat, the blue cardigan she wore in hospital, scarves that still held her perfume. I labeled each box carefully. Keep, charity shop, Sarah. I had even contacted an estate agent about selling my house. The house in York where Margaret and I had spent almost 30 years. The house where my wife took her final breath downstairs because she wanted to see the garden. Elaine said we would not need it. She promised me a cottage near the coast. Nothing grand, 2 bedrooms, a small garden, and space for lavender. She spoke about morning walks, shared breakfasts, and taking turns to cook Sunday lunch. "You've spent long enough living among memories," she told me. "It's time we made some of our own." I believed her. I wrote farewell cards to several neighbors. I told Brian next door I might be moving away. He looked surprised, then pleased. "Good for you, Peter. You deserve a fresh start." That was exactly what I thought Elaine was offering. A new beginning. On the morning she was supposedly traveling home from France, I woke before 6. I shaved twice because I missed a patch beneath my chin. I polished my shoes and placed the ring box inside my jacket. At 8:30, someone knocked. I expected a delivery. Instead, 2 police officers stood beneath the porch. One showed me Elaine's photograph. Then he asked a question that made the hallway seem to tilt. "Mr. Langford, do you recognize the name Helen Mercer?" I said no. He looked at the photograph. Helen Mercer was the woman in these pictures. I gripped the hall table. "Where is she?" The officer paused. Then he said, very gently, "She died nearly 3 years ago." Even now, I could hear those words exactly as he had spoken them. Not missing. Not hiding. Dead. I had thought the worst thing I could discover was that Elaine did not love me. I was wrong. The worst thing was discovering whose life she had stolen to make me love her. Aisha closed the folder, but left the photograph on the table. I stared at the woman I had planned to marry. If the face belonged to someone who had been dead for 3 years, who had been laughing with me every night, who had listened while I spoke about Margaret's final days, and who, all that time, had been waiting for me to trust her enough to leave everything behind. 4 years before Elaine entered my life, Margaret died in the front room of our house in York. We had been married for 41 years. For nearly 3 decades, we had lived in the same modest, semi-detached house, near the city center, with birds in the garden before the traffic began. Our life together had never been grand. Tea at 7:30. Saturday mornings at the market. Sunday lunch with Sarah when she was free. A week in Whitby most summers. Small arguments about the heating, usually because Margaret turned it up and I quietly turned it down again. Crossword puzzles left unfinished on the kitchen table because one of us insisted the clue was wrong. After she died, I kept those routines for longer than made sense. For weeks, I still reached for 2 mugs. If something amusing came on the radio, I turned towards her side of the room before remembering there was no one there. Her coat stayed hanging by the back door for nearly a year. I told myself I had simply forgotten to move it. The truth was that taking it down felt too final. I had retired from the railway before Margaret became ill. For 38 years, I had worked in signaling, where every shift had a timetable and every decision mattered. During her illness, caring for her gave my days another structure. Tablets at 8, hospital appointments, soup at midday if she could manage it, fresh bedding on Thursdays. Once she was gone, nobody needed me at a particular hour. No colleague expected me. No voice asked when I would be home. My world became smaller without my noticing. I visited the supermarket early, when it was quiet. I attended the railway history group once a month, but rarely stayed for coffee. Sometimes I joined a walking group on the outskirts of York. The countryside was lovely, but seeing couples share sandwiches or wait while one tied a bootlace made the path feel lonelier than the house. Sarah rang twice a week and came when work and the children allowed. "How are you doing, Dad?" "Fine. Have you been out?" "Oh, yes, busy enough." By busy, I meant I had bought birdseed, posted a letter, or walked to the chemist. I never wanted to become another responsibility in her crowded life. At Christmas, I spent the afternoon with Sarah, her husband, and the children. The house was warm, noisy, and full of plates nobody had room for. I laughed. I joined in. I even wore the paper crown from my cracker. But when I drove home, I sat outside my own house for several minutes with the engine off. Through the windscreen, I could see the dark sitting room window. I did not want to go inside. That was the part I never told Sarah. One evening, while scrolling through Facebook, I noticed a group called British Gardens, Heritage Walks and Quiet Places. Margaret had loved gardens, so I joined. At first, I only read what other people posted. Then someone shared a photograph of Fountains Abbey and named the wrong footpath beside it. Without thinking, I left a polite correction. A woman named Elaine Carter replied beneath my comment. "You sound like someone who knows how to notice the places everyone else walks past." I read the sentence once. Then again. No one had spoken to me that way in years. It did not feel like flirting. It felt like being noticed. I had no way of knowing whether Elaine was simply being kind or whether she had already understood exactly what was missing from my life. Elaine sent me a private message later that evening. "I hope you don't mind me replying. I enjoyed your comment about Fountains Abbey. Most people would simply have said I was wrong." There was something refreshingly polite about it. No emojis, no exaggerated compliments, just proper sentences, carefully written. I replied because it would have seemed rude not to. "Not at all. I've always had a weakness for old footpaths." Within minutes, she answered, "Perhaps that says something about you. You notice the details other people walk straight past." I smiled to myself. It was such an ordinary exchange, yet it lingered with me long after I'd put the kettle on. Over the next fortnight, our conversations became more frequent. They never felt forced. Elaine didn't ask intrusive questions or rush into personal matters. Instead, she asked about the railway. "What made you stay in the same job for so many years?" I told her I liked knowing that people reached home safely because someone had done their job properly. She replied, "That sounds rather like love, doesn't it? Quietly looking after people without expecting applause." No one had ever described my working life quite like that. I found myself telling her stories I'd not thought about for years. The snowy winter when every signal seemed determined to fail. The station master who insisted on making tea for every late-night shift. The first holiday Margaret and I took after we'd finally managed to save enough money. Elaine listened. Or at least, she gave every impression that she did. She remembered details. If I mentioned Whitby on a Tuesday, she'd ask about it again the following week. If I spoke about Margaret's favorite flowers, she'd remember the name months later. That sort of attention is difficult to resist when you've spent years speaking mostly to yourself. Eventually, she told me about her own life. Her husband, Robert, had died 6 years earlier. She described him as kind, dependable, and hopeless at wrapping Christmas presents. "I still expect to hear his key in the front door some evenings," she admitted. I understood that immediately. "There are mornings," I confessed, "when I still say good morning to Margaret before I remember." Elaine didn't tell me to move on. She didn't say time healed everything. Instead, She wrote something I've never forgotten. Grief doesn't make a home smaller. It makes every room feel unfamiliar. I stared at those words for a long time. She had somehow described exactly what I'd been unable to explain, even to Sarah. Soon afterwards, she told me why she couldn't meet in person. She normally lived near Harrogate, she said, but was temporarily staying outside Lille in northern France. Her older sister, Caroline, had recently undergone hip surgery and needed someone to help her recover. It won't be forever, Elaine assured me. I expect to be back in Yorkshire within a couple of months. That sounded entirely reasonable. If anything, I admired her willingness to care for family. The distance didn't worry me, because she never spoke about staying abroad. She only talked about coming home. Gradually, I noticed something else. Whenever I shared a thought that had been weighing on me, Elaine seemed to understand it before I had fully explained. One evening, I admitted something I'd never said aloud to anyone outside my family. I sometimes feel guilty for wanting company again. Her reply arrived a minute later. Loving someone new does not erase the person who taught you how to love. I had to put my phone down. Margaret had made me promise, during her final months, that I wouldn't spend the rest of my life alone. At the time, I'd dismissed it because I couldn't imagine another future. Now, for the first time, I told someone about that promise. Elaine's answer was gentle. Perhaps the two of you kept that promise together. A fortnight later, we spoke on the telephone. I'd expected the conversation to last 20 minutes. Instead, nearly 2 hours slipped by without either of us noticing. Her voice was soft, warm, and unmistakably British. She laughed at my terrible jokes. She teased me for still carrying a paper diary. Before hanging up, she became unexpectedly quiet. I'd forgotten what it feels like, she said, to look forward to tomorrow. So had I admitted. That night, I went to bed smiling. A few days later, I suggested a video call. There was a brief silence before she apologized. The internet here is dreadful. Half the time it barely manages ordinary calls. Then she added, almost shyly, and I've lost so much weight looking after Caroline that I hardly recognize myself. I'd rather wait until I'm home. I didn't question it. If anything, her hesitation made her seem more genuine. Looking back now, I realize I was measuring honesty by emotion instead of evidence. At the time, though, I believed I'd met a woman who trusted me with her deepest thoughts. So why did she always find a reason not to let me see her face live on a screen? Once our telephone conversations became part of everyday life, everything else seemed to arrange itself around them. I no longer reached for the newspaper first thing in the morning. I reached for my phone. Without fail, there would already be a message waiting. Good morning, Peter. Have you slept any better? Or perhaps, don't forget your blood pressure tablets before you head into town. At first, I thought it was simply thoughtful. Then I realized she remembered things I had mentioned only once. She knew Sarah usually worked late on Tuesdays. She remembered Daniel's GC revision had been making him anxious. When I mentioned my arthritis had been bothering me after gardening, she asked about it again several days later. Those little details mattered. They made me feel seen. As the weeks passed, my routine quietly changed. If Elaine usually rang around 8 in the evening, I made sure I was home before then. I stopped lingering after the monthly railway history meeting because I didn't want to miss her call. One Thursday, the walking group suggested stopping for coffee after a walk along the River Ouse. I'd better head off, I said. Brian, who'd walked beside me most of the morning, grinned. Got an online girlfriend waiting for you, have you? The others chuckled. It was harmless enough, but I felt unexpectedly protective. It's nothing like that. No offense meant. I know. Even so, I didn't return the following month. Something about hearing our friendship reduced to a joke made me want to keep it to myself. Elaine wasn't an amusement. She was becoming the person I looked forward to speaking with most. Over the next 3 months, she sent photographs that seemed wonderfully ordinary. One showed her sitting beside a kitchen window, with rain running down the glass. Another captured her holding a cream-colored mug with Yorkshire printed across the front. She sent a picture of herself browsing a market in northern France, smiling beneath a blue scarf she said had belonged to her mother. A few days later, she photographed the novel I'd recommended, open halfway through with a bookmark tucked neatly inside. "I was right," she wrote. "It is every bit as good as you promised. Nothing about the pictures seemed staged. They looked exactly like the sort of photographs anyone might send to someone they cared about." One afternoon, after I jokingly admitted that even sensible men sometimes worried about being fooled online, Elaine replied almost immediately, "I completely understand." A few minutes later, another image arrived. It was a photograph of a passport. Part of it had been covered by her hand, as though she didn't want to reveal unnecessary personal details. But I could clearly read the name: Elaine Margaret Carter. The photograph matched the woman I'd come to know. "There," she said during our call that evening. "No more worrying." I actually felt embarrassed for doubting her. "I'm sorry. You never need apologize for being careful." That answer reassured me even more. Slowly, our conversations shifted from memories to plans. She spoke about returning to England before the summer ended. "I don't want a grand house," she said one evening. "I've had enough of chasing bigger things. What do you want?" "A small cottage somewhere between York and the coast." "Whitby?" She laughed. "You've become determined to retire there." "I have." "Then perhaps we'll begin there." We imagined taking the train to Edinburgh for a few days, planting lavender in the garden, adopting an older rescue dog that nobody else wanted, cooking Sunday lunch together while arguing over whose roast potatoes were better. The dreams were simple. Perhaps that's why they felt possible. One rainy Saturday, I finally opened the spare room where Margaret's belongings still filled the wardrobes. I stood quietly for several minutes before lifting the first box. Every jumper, every photograph, every carefully folded scarf. It was the hardest afternoon I'd faced since her funeral. Yet I wasn't clearing the room because I wanted to forget my wife. I was doing it because I believed she would have wanted me to keep living. While sorting through an old drawer, I found Margaret's engagement ring box. I closed it almost immediately. That ring belonged to our life together. If I ever proposed again, it had to be with a different ring. The following week, I visited a small independent jeweler in York. Nothing extravagant, just a simple gold band with a tiny diamond. The sort of ring Margaret herself would have admired. I hid it inside the top drawer of my desk. Not because Elaine had asked me, because I hoped one day I might. Without realizing it, I also began sharing practical details about my life. That I owned the house outright. That my railway pension comfortably covered my bills. That Margaret's life insurance had left me with modest savings. That I handled my finances myself. Elaine never once asked how much money I had. Instead, she spoke about her own independence. I've always preferred standing on my own 2 feet. Hearing that, I volunteered information naturally, never suspecting she might be quietly building a picture of everything I owned. One evening, just before we said goodnight, her voice softened. "When I come home, Peter, I don't want us wasting years wondering whether we should have been brave." I closed my eyes. Neither did I. But as I placed the engagement ring back into its little box, I couldn't help wondering, had I finally found the courage to begin living again? Or had someone already learned everything they needed to take my future away? For a while, everything carried on much as before. Elaine still wished me good morning. She still remembered the little things. She still ended every evening by saying, "Sleep well, Peter." If there were moments that troubled me, they were so small that I felt almost ashamed of noticing them. One Tuesday evening, she mentioned that Caroline's operation had taken place in Rouen. I frowned slightly. "I thought you said the hospital was near Lille." There was the briefest pause. "Oh, yes. She was transferred afterwards. They had a specialist there." It sounded perfectly sensible. People are moved between hospitals every day. I apologized for questioning her. You've every right to ask, she replied warmly. I'd probably do the same. The unease disappeared almost as quickly as it had arrived. A week later, we were talking about childhood holidays. I grew up in a little village outside Harrogate, she said. What was it called? There was another pause. Oh goodness, you'll laugh. I doubt it. My mind's all over the place lately. She gave the name of a village I didn't recognize. Oddly enough, I was certain she'd mentioned a different one several weeks earlier. Again, I told myself it was nothing. I'd forgotten names myself often enough. Besides, she was caring for an elderly sister while living in another country. Anyone would be tired. Individually, each inconsistency seemed harmless. Only later did I realize they were beginning to form a pattern. There was something else. Elaine was never available unexpectedly. If she arranged to ring at 8 o'clock, she rang at 8. If I phoned her at 6:30 instead, she almost never answered. A few minutes later, a message would appear. Sorry, Peter. I'm with Caroline's doctor. Or, just helping the district nurse. I'll ring later. And she always did. Eventually, I stopped calling without warning. It simply seemed easier to wait for her. Then her telephone number changed. The French SIM has stopped working, she explained. I've had to buy another. A fortnight later, it changed again. This one was damaged. I laughed. You've no luck with phones. I certainly haven't. I accepted every explanation. After all, nothing truly alarming had happened. One Saturday afternoon, Daniel came to visit. He found me smiling at one of Elaine's photographs. Is that her? Yes. He sat beside me. She looks nice. She is. I handed him my phone. The picture showed Elaine sitting outside a garden cafe, wearing the blue scarf she'd inherited from her mother. Daniel enlarged the image. What are you doing? Just looking. He zoomed in further. The cafe umbrellas cast strong summer shadows. The flower boxes were overflowing. He glanced at me. When did she send this? Last week. In France? Yes. He frowned. It looked freezing on the news last week. I shrugged. Perhaps they had better weather. He didn't argue. Instead, he quietly took a screenshot. Later that evening, he told me he'd tried searching for the photograph online. Did you find anything? No exact match. There you are then. He hesitated. But something still feels odd. I smiled patiently. Not everything can be explained by computers, Dan. I know. It's possible for someone to be genuine even if technology can't prove it. He nodded. I hope you're right. So did I. A few days later, Elaine mentioned Sarah. You've spoken about her a lot. I'm very proud of her. I can tell. There was a brief silence. Then she said something that stayed with me. Adult children sometimes struggle when a widowed parent becomes independent again. What do you mean? Oh, nothing unpleasant. She sounded almost reluctant to continue. It's just that children become used to being needed. I'm sure Sarah only wants the best for me. I'm certain she does. Another pause. But perhaps she's also used to being the most important woman in your life. The words were spoken gently. Without accusation, without bitterness. Yet once I'd heard them, they lingered. The following Friday, Elaine finally announced she was returning to England for 3 days to deal with some paperwork. I'll fly into Manchester. I'll come and meet you. I'd love that. For the first time in months, the distance between us finally seemed to be disappearing. I bought a small bunch of white lilies because she'd once told me they were her favorite flowers. The engagement ring rested safely inside my coat pocket. I arrived at Manchester Airport almost an hour early. Every time the arrivals doors opened, my heart lifted. Families reunited. Business travelers hurried past. Children ran into waiting arms. I checked my watch again. Her flight had landed. Then my phone rang. It was Elaine. She was crying so hard I could barely understand her. Peter. Caroline collapsed just before we left for the airport. What? The ambulance came. You stayed with her? I couldn't leave? No, of course you couldn't. I'm so frightened you'll think I abandoned you. I looked at the flowers in my hand. No. You believe me? Yes. I always will. 4 hours later, I drove back to York alone. The lilies lay untouched on the passenger seat beside me. I kept telling myself there would be another chance, but somewhere beneath the disappointment, a quiet doubt had begun to grow. Why did every moment that should have brought Elaine into my life somehow end with her just out of reach? 3 days passed after the missed meeting at Manchester Airport. Elaine sounded exhausted whenever we spoke. Sometimes she apologized before saying anything else. I've ruined everything, haven't I? You haven't ruined anything. I keep thinking about you standing there waiting. I'd rather wait for you than lose you. She became quiet. Then I heard her crying. Not loudly, just enough to make me feel helpless. I don't deserve you, Peter. You don't have to earn kindness. Those words came naturally. Looking back, I often wonder whether she had been waiting for me to say something exactly like that. A few evenings later, our usual call came much later than expected. Her voice was flat, almost distant. Is everything all right? I honestly don't know anymore. What do you mean? There was a long silence before she answered. Caroline's condition has become more complicated. I'm sorry. I didn't want to tell you because I thought we were finally getting close to coming home. What happened? The hospital says she needs specialist transport after she's discharged. I listened carefully. The problem is, she sighed, my own bank account has been frozen. Frozen? Something to do with probate paperwork after Robert died. The solicitor warned me it might happen while they checked a few documents. I frowned. Surely they can sort it quickly. They say they will. So what's the problem? Another pause. I'll manage somehow? She didn't ask for anything. Instead, she tried to change the subject. We spoke about the weather, about York Minster, about a television program we'd both watched. Yet something had changed. She sounded distracted. When we were about to end the call, I stopped her. Elaine. Yes? You haven't told me everything. She breathed in slowly. I don't want to burden you. You won't. It's embarrassing. Tell me. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, the hospital needs payment before they'll arrange Caroline's private medical transport. How much? I can't ask you that. You haven't asked. No. So tell me. I'll find another way. Elaine. Another silence. Then she answered, £3,800. The figure caught me off guard. It wasn't a small amount, but it also wasn't impossible. Margaret and I had always been careful with money. Years of railway work, sensible saving, and her life insurance meant I had enough to live comfortably. Helping someone I loved through an unexpected crisis didn't seem reckless. It seemed exactly what Margaret would have expected me to do. I'll send it. No? You need help. I couldn't possibly. You would do the same for me. Her breathing became uneven. I'll pay you back within 10 days. I know. I've never felt so ashamed. You've nothing to be ashamed of. The following morning, I walked into my bank branch in York. The young advisor behind the desk was polite but thorough. What is the purpose of the transfer, Mr. Langford? It's to help someone with medical expenses. He typed for a moment. This payment is going to an overseas account belonging to someone called Mark Dillon. Yes. Could I ask who Mr. Dillon is? He's arranging medical transport. The advisor looked up. I'm required to ask whether you've met the person requesting this payment. We know each other well. Have you met in person? I hesitated. Not yet. He nodded slowly. We're seeing an increasing number of romance fraud cases involving overseas accounts. Immediately I felt defensive. This isn't one of those. I'm not suggesting it is. I'm perfectly capable of making my own decisions. I understand, Mr. Langford. We simply have a duty to check. As I left the bank, I found myself thinking about something Elaine had said weeks earlier. Banks sometimes treat older people as though they've forgotten how to think for themselves. At the time I'd laughed. Now the warning seemed oddly accurate. That evening she rang. The relief in her voice was overwhelming. "You've saved Caroline. I've only helped." "No?" She was crying again. "You've saved both of us." Then, for the first time since we'd met, she said quietly, "My love." The words settled somewhere deep inside me. I didn't feel as though I'd bought affection. I felt I'd protected someone who mattered. 2 days later, another message arrived. There had been an unexpected problem at customs. Specialist medical equipment had been delayed. A refundable security payment of £7,500 was suddenly required. This time I didn't answer immediately. Several minutes later, another message appeared. "I understand if you can't help. I'll find another way." Then, nothing. No calls. No messages. Hours passed. For the first time since we'd met, I wasn't worried about the money. I was terrified of losing her. And without realizing it, I was already wondering how I could possibly find another £7,500. I barely slept after Elaine's last message. The request itself troubled me, but it wasn't the money that kept me awake. It was the silence. Until then, she had always found time to send a good-night message, even on her busiest days. This time, after saying she understood if I couldn't help, she disappeared completely. By breakfast the following morning, I had checked my phone so many times that I stopped pretending I wasn't waiting. Around midday, Sarah called. "Dad, are you at home?" "I am. I've just finished with a patient nearby. Mind if I pop in?" Of course. She arrived carrying a loaf from the bakery I liked and a small bag of apples. "I thought you might have run out. You didn't need to do that." "I know." She smiled. I wanted to. While I made tea, she wandered into the kitchen. Her eyes settled on a folded leaflet lying beside the kettle. It had the bank's logo across the top. "How to protect yourself from fraud." She picked it up. "Where did this come from? The bank? Were you sorting something out?" "Oh, just a transfer." She looked at me carefully. "What sort of transfer?" I hesitated too long. "Dad." I lent Elaine a bit of money. Her expression changed immediately. "How much?" "It doesn't matter. It matters to me." 3,800. The room fell completely silent. She sat down slowly. "You sent someone you've never met nearly £4,000? She didn't ask. Then why did you send it?" "Because she needed help." Sarah took a deep breath. "I'm not judging you. It feels like you are. I'm worried. There isn't any reason to be." She reached across the table. "Dad, please." I pulled my hand away. "If you spoke to her, you'd understand." "I'd like to." "What?" "I'd like to speak to Elaine." I shook my head. "She's dealing with enough already." "Then, perhaps a quick video call." "She isn't comfortable with that." Sarah looked at me for several seconds before speaking again. "You've known her for months." "I know. You've never actually seen her live on camera." She explained why. "Dad." "No." My voice was firmer than I intended. "I'm not putting her through an interrogation." Sarah nodded slowly. Then she asked a question I hadn't expected. What name was on the bank account? It wasn't hers. She frowned. Why not? It belonged to the medical transport company. What was the name? I remembered it immediately. Mark Delon. She lowered her eyes. That doesn't sound right. You don't know anything about French healthcare. No. But I know enough to ask questions. I felt irritation rising inside me. I'm 69, Sarah. I know. I don't need permission to help someone. I'm not trying to control you. It certainly feels that way, she sighed. I just don't want anyone taking advantage of you. Before I could answer, my phone vibrated. Elaine. I glanced at the screen, instinctively. Sarah noticed. Is that her? Yes. Please, answer on speaker. I won't. I stepped into the hallway and returned the call. Elaine sounded gentle as ever. "How are you?" "I'm all right. I hope I haven't caused trouble." "What makes you say that?" I had a feeling Sarah might be asking questions. I hadn't mentioned Sarah was there. The thought barely registered at the time. "We've had a little disagreement. I'm so sorry. It isn't your fault. I'd hate to come between you." "You won't." She paused. "Perhaps—" "What?" "Perhaps it would be kinder if we kept our plans private until I'm back in England. I don't like hiding things." "Neither do I." Her voice became quieter. "But sometimes people misunderstand what they can't see." It sounded reasonable, even thoughtful. When I returned to the kitchen, Sarah was waiting. "What did she say?" "Nothing important." She looked disappointed. Later that evening, Daniel arrived after college. "I've been looking at those photographs again." I smiled. "Still playing detective?" "Just humor me." He enlarged the picture of Elaine holding the Yorkshire mug. Instead of looking at her face, he cropped the mug itself. A few minutes later, he found the exact image on the website of a gift shop. "Maybe she owns the same mug," I suggested. "Maybe." Then he opened another photograph, the one taken outside the garden cafe. He enlarged a hanging flower basket reflected in the window. Another search. This time his face changed. "I've found something." It wasn't the photograph itself. It was an old local newspaper article from Devon. The same woman, the same smile. The headline identified her as Helen Mercer, a primary school administrator raising money for a local hospice. I stared without speaking. There must be an explanation. Daniel kept searching. A few moments later, another page appeared. A memorial notice. Helen Mercer, beloved mother and grandmother, passed away peacefully 3 years ago. My mouth went dry. At that exact moment, my phone vibrated again. A message from Elaine. "Please, Peter, I need the second payment tonight or everything we've dreamed about will disappear." I looked from the screen to the photograph of a woman who, according to everything now in front of me, had been dead for 3 years. For the first time since meeting Elaine, I no longer knew which truth would hurt more. I couldn't stop looking at the memorial notice. The smiling woman in the photograph was identical to Elaine, the same silver blonde hair, the same gentle eyes, the same blue scarf. Only the name beneath the picture read, Helen Mercer. And the date below it confirmed she had died nearly 3 years earlier. "There has to be another explanation," I whispered. Daniel looked at me with the sort of expression no grandson should ever have to wear. "I hope there is, Granddad." Sarah placed a hand gently on my shoulder. "Dad, please don't send any more money." I wanted to believe her. I truly did. But another part of me clung desperately to everything Elaine and I had shared over the previous months. The conversations, the laughter, the plans, the ring hidden in my desk drawer. Surely none of that could have been invented. Before either of us spoke again, there was another knock at the door. Sarah opened it. A woman in plain clothes stood outside holding a warrant card. "Mr. Peter Langford?" "Yes. I'm Detective Constable Aisha Rahman from North Yorkshire Police." She stepped inside only after I invited her. There was nothing dramatic about her manner. No accusation, no raised voice. She simply sat at my kitchen table and waited until I was ready to speak. "I'm very sorry we're meeting under these circumstances." I nodded silently. Sarah explained what Daniel had discovered. The detective listened without interrupting. When she finally spoke, her words surprised me. "You are not the first person this has happened to." I should have known. "No." She shook her head gently. "People often believe these crimes begin with money. They don't. They begin with trust." I frowned. "The money comes much later." She folded her hands on the table. "Someone spends months learning what matters to you. They become part of your daily routine. They make you afraid of losing the relationship. Once that happens," she paused. Asking for money becomes far easier. Every sentence seemed to describe my life with uncomfortable accuracy. She wasn't reading from my messages. She was describing the way I had been thinking. "I still don't understand," I said quietly. "If the photographs belong to someone else, that's exactly what we intend to find out." She asked whether I would help them. "How?" "Carry on speaking to her." I stared. "You want me to pretend?" "We'd like to trace the accounts and communication. I don't know if I can. I appreciate how difficult it will be." She did not pressure me. She simply waited. After several minutes, I agreed. The following evening, under the detective's guidance, I called Elaine. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear the ringing. She answered almost immediately. "My love." Hearing those words again hurt far more than I expected. "I've been worried about you," she said. "So have I." I forced myself to sound calm. "I've nearly arranged the 7,500. "Oh, Peter." She sounded relieved. "I knew you'd never give up on us. I just need your solicitor's details once more." There was a pause. Longer than usual. "Why?" "I want everything correct before I transfer the money." "You don't trust me?" "I didn't say that." "You either trust me." Her voice changed. The softness disappeared. "Or you don't." For the first time since we had met, I heard impatience beneath her kindness. It lasted only a second. Then her gentle tone returned. But it was enough. After the call ended, Detective Rahman looked across the table. "Did you notice the difference?" I nodded slowly. She sounded different. "Because you interrupted the script." Over the following days, investigators traced the calls. The numbers were not coming from rural France at all. They were being routed through internet telephone services. The bank account receiving my money belonged to a man living in Birmingham. Further inquiries led police towards addresses in Leeds and Bradford. What they discovered shocked even the investigators. The group had been targeting widowed and divorced people over 60 across Britain. Every victim had been encouraged to believe they had found love. Every relationship had been carefully constructed over months. At first, detectives assumed I had been speaking to a much younger man using voice-changing software. They were wrong. The truth was stranger, and somehow even more painful. The woman behind Elaine was 58-year-old Janet Reeves, a former care home administrator from West Yorkshire. She had once worked alongside the real Helen Mercer. When Helen died, Janet copied photographs that former colleagues had privately shared. She knew Helen's expressions, her mannerisms, even the stories people told about her. Detective Rahman placed another folder in front of me. This was recovered from Janet's computer. Inside were files, dozens of them, each named after a different person. One folder carried my name. Inside were typed notes. Widower, 4 years. Railway pension. Owns property outright. Close to daughter but emotionally isolated. Feels guilty about loving again. Responds strongly to references about late wife. Avoid direct pressure. Allow him to offer financial help himself. I felt physically sick. Every comforting conversation, every thoughtful reply, every sentence that had made me feel understood, had been written because someone had studied my grief. Then Detective Rahman showed me one final file, an audio recording, my own voice. I recognized it instantly. Months earlier, I had told Elaine about Margaret's final week in hospital. How she'd squeezed my hand. How she'd asked me not to spend the rest of my life alone. Janet had saved the recording. Its title was only 4 words. Emotional leverage, major request. In that moment, I realized the money was never the greatest thing I'd lost. Someone had taken the most private memories of my marriage and filed them away as tools to be used against me. I wasn't sure any prison sentence could ever undo that kind of theft. When Detective Rahman rang to tell me arrests had been made, I didn't know how to feel. For months, I had imagined discovering who Elaine really was. Now that I knew, there was no satisfaction, only a strange emptiness. "They've arrested 4 people," she said. 1 in Birmingham, 2 in Leeds, and Janet Reeves in Bradford. I thanked her quietly. After the call ended, I sat in the conservatory, watching the rain slide down the glass. Part of me had expected to feel victorious. Instead, I felt tired. A week later, Detective Rahman visited my house. She explained that officers had seized laptops, mobile phones, forged documents, and notebooks containing dozens of victims' names. "Unfortunately," she said gently, "you weren't the only one." She showed me a chart. Every line represented another person: a widower from Norfolk, a retired nurse from Cumbria, a former teacher in Kent, an elderly gentleman in Cornwall who had remortgaged his bungalow because he believed he was helping the woman he intended to marry. Some had lost £5,000. Some had lost 50,000. One man had sold his caravan. Another had emptied nearly all of his pension savings. Listening to those stories changed something inside me. For months, I had believed I had failed because I was lonely. Now I understood that loneliness had simply been the doorway they knew how to unlock. The shame I had been carrying no longer felt quite so personal. Detective Rahman then asked a question I had been dreading. "Would you be willing to provide a victim impact statement?" "I'd rather not." "I understand. I don't want people recognizing me." You'd be surprised how many people in that courtroom will already understand exactly what you've been through. Even so, I wasn't convinced. The thought of standing in court and admitting how completely I had been deceived made my stomach tighten. When Sarah heard I was hesitating, she drove over that evening. She found me in the garden trimming the lavender Margaret had planted years earlier. "You don't have to do this alone." "I know. I'll sit beside you." "I don't want everyone looking at me." "They won't be looking at you because you're weak." She smiled gently. "They'll be looking because you're brave enough to tell the truth." A few weeks later, I found myself sitting in a courtroom. Janet Reeves sat several meters away. It was the first time I had seen the real woman. She looked nothing like the gentle, grieving widow, whose voice had accompanied my mornings and evenings. She never looked towards me. When I was invited to read my statement, my hands trembled so much that I could barely hold the paper. "I didn't only lose money," I began. "My wife and I spent decades building those savings, but that isn't what hurts most." The courtroom became silent. I was persuaded to doubt my own daughter. I glanced towards Sarah. She smiled encouragingly. I packed away my late wife's belongings because I believed I was beginning a new chapter. I paused. I even spoke to an estate agent about selling the only home Margaret and I ever truly shared. My voice cracked. "You didn't steal my future. You nearly persuaded me to abandon my past." When I finished, nobody spoke for several moments. Janet eventually pleaded guilty to multiple offenses involving fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy to launder criminal proceeds. Her 3 accomplices also received prison sentences. The judge described the scheme as a calculated exploitation of grief and trust. Some money was recovered from frozen accounts. Months later, I received compensation covering part of my first transfer. Only part. Most of what I'd sent had disappeared forever. Oddly enough, by then the money mattered less than it once had. Not because it wasn't important, because something else had begun to heal. Before the case concluded, Detective Rahman told me that Helen Mercer's family had finally been informed their mother's photographs had been used in the fraud. For days, I wondered whether I should write to them. In the end, I did. I apologized for unknowingly becoming part of something that had stolen Helen's memory as well as my trust. I never expected a reply. 2 weeks later, an envelope arrived. It was from Helen's daughter. Her letter contained only a few paragraphs. One sentence stayed with me more than any other. "You did not steal my mum's face. Someone stole her from both of us." I read those words over and over again. For the first time since everything had happened, I felt some of the weight I had been carrying begin to lift. Janet Reeves had been sentenced. The gang had been dismantled. Justice, imperfect though it was, had finally arrived. But one question still lingered in my mind. If someone smiled at me tomorrow, would I ever be able to believe kindness again without wondering what might be hiding behind it? It took me a long time to stop reaching for my phone each morning. For months after the trial ended, I still woke just before 7. Without thinking, I would glance at the bedside table, almost expecting to see another cheerful message waiting for me. "Good morning, Peter." Then I would remember. There was no Elaine. There never had been. Only carefully chosen words sent by someone who had learned how loneliness sounds. Old habits fade slowly, especially the ones attached to hope. Sarah visited more often after everything was over, though never because she believed I couldn't manage alone. She understood something important. Being independent and being lonely are not the same thing. Sometimes we sat in the garden without saying very much. Sometimes Daniel came as well, usually carrying another book he insisted I should read. One afternoon he placed a small envelope on the kitchen table. "What's this?" "Open it." Inside were 2 tickets. The North Yorkshire Moors Railway. "We thought you might like another railway trip." "We?" "Mum and I." I smiled. "It isn't a birthday. It doesn't have to be." The 3 of us traveled together the following weekend. As the old steam locomotive pulled away from the platform, I realized it was the first journey I had taken simply for pleasure since Margaret died. The countryside rolled quietly past the carriage windows. Heather covered the distant hills. Families waved from station platforms. Children counted sheep in the fields. For the first time in years, I wasn't thinking about the past or the future. I was simply enjoying the day. A few months later, Detective Rahman invited me to speak at a community event organized by the local police and Age UK. My first instinct was to refuse. "I don't think I'm the right person." "You are exactly the right person," she replied. "People don't need another officer quoting statistics. They need someone who understands why intelligent people can still be deceived." I stood before about 60 people that afternoon. Most were around my own age. Some had lost partners. Some lived alone. Others cared for aging spouses. Looking around the room, I recognized expressions I had once seen in the mirror. Not foolishness. Not weakness. Simply the quiet hope that life might still have one unexpected gift left to offer. I told them everything. Not only about the money, about the mornings, the conversations, the comfort, the dreams. "The scam didn't begin with a bank transfer," I said. "It began the day someone convinced me I no longer had to feel lonely." Nobody laughed. Nobody judged me. Instead, several people nodded. When the meeting ended, an elderly gentleman approached me. "My wife died 6 years ago." "I'm sorry." "So am I." He hesitated before continuing. "I nearly sent money to someone last winter." He smiled faintly. "After hearing your story, I won't." At that moment, I understood something Detective Rahman had been trying to tell me from the beginning. The worst thing that had happened to me no longer belonged only to me. If sharing it protected even one other person, then perhaps my experience still had value. Later that year, I finally did something I had been avoiding. I opened the drawer containing the engagement ring. The little box looked exactly as it had months earlier. For a long time, I simply held it. Then I walked into the sitting room, where Margaret's photograph still stood on the bookshelf. "I thought I was replacing you," I said quietly. "I never could." I smiled through tears. And perhaps I was never meant to. The next morning I returned to the jeweler in York. The owner recognized me immediately. "Was everything all right with the proposal?" I smiled gently. "There wasn't one." "I'm sorry." So was I. I explained a little of what had happened. Not everything. Just enough. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he opened the ring box and looked at it for a moment. This is still a beautiful ring. It is. What would you like me to do with it? I thought for several seconds. Could it become two pendants? Two? One for my daughter, and the other? My grandson. I'd like them to remember that love should never be measured by promises alone. Several weeks later, Sarah and Daniel opened the small gift boxes together. Neither of them spoke immediately. Sarah simply hugged me. Daniel looked at the pendant resting in his palm. I'll keep it. I hope you do. So I remember? So, you remember. Not to trust anyone? I shook my head. No. Remember to trust wisely. There is a difference. He nodded slowly. I think I understand. Life did not suddenly become perfect after that. I still missed Margaret every day. There were still evenings when the house felt too quiet. There were still moments when I caught myself wondering what life might have been if the woman I'd loved online had actually existed. But I also learned something I never expected. Losing trust does not have to mean losing kindness. I still smile at strangers. I still stop to talk with neighbors. I still join the walking group for coffee after our monthly walks. Sometimes Brian still jokes about me finding another sweetheart. Now I laugh with him. Not because I believe love is impossible, because I know real love never asks you to prove it by sacrificing your peace of mind. If someone truly cares for you, they will never ask you to choose between them and your family. They will never rush your trust. They will never isolate you from the people who have loved you longest. Looking back, I no longer think the most important telephone call I received was the one from Detective Rahman. It was the one Sarah made that afternoon when she simply asked if she could come round with a loaf of bread and a bag of apples. At the time, I thought she was interrupting my future. In truth, she was quietly saving it. If my story reaches someone sitting alone tonight, someone grieving, someone hoping, someone wondering whether a stranger on a screen might finally fill the silence, I hope you'll remember one thing. Loneliness is never something to be ashamed of. It is part of being human, but anyone who truly deserves a place in your life will help you grow closer to the people who already love you, not further away from them. That is the difference between love and the lie I almost mistook for it.